Alright guys, welcome back to another video, and today we're going to be going over my new $750 gaming PC for 2022. So I'm going to be showing you guys the entire build process, all of the parts that I use, and some tips for building a PC at this similar price range. So as you guys can already see, the PC is fully built, but I actually recorded myself putting this thing together earlier. So what I'm going to do is actually create a little montage for you guys so you guys can see me putting it together in action. Okay, so now that you guys saw me put this thing together, now let's go through all the parts that I used. So a lot of these parts in this PC is actually parts that I've had previously in my old PC, so the only things that I've upgraded are a couple of things. One of those things are actually the case. So this here is the Corsair iQ220T RGB Airflow, and this is definitely a huge upgrade over my old case, which was just really plain and kind of outdated with features. So with this case, which I really like a lot, is first it comes with 3 RGB fans in the front. I was looking to buy a fan kit anyway, so since the case already came with it, it was really nice. The second thing I like about this is this thing here, which hides your power supply and all of the wires. So on my old case, it was pretty outdated. You could actually still see the power supply and all of its wires. So having this thing to cover it all makes it a lot cleaner, and I like it a lot. The only thing I don't like about this case is the rear side panel, since it doesn't have a little gap on the end, so it's really hard to cable manage, but it's something that you can definitely deal with. And I know a lot of people don't actually like the front side of this case, which I actually like a lot compared to my older case, which is actually also a Corsair one as well, but it was just super plain in the front. So actually having some kind of design that's kind of unique is really cool. So moving on to the CPU, it's the i7-8700K. It's a 6-core 12-thread CPU that I've had for almost like 2 to 3 years now. It came from my old build, so I'm still using it here. Although it is an older Intel CPU, it still holds up pretty well even compared to newer CPUs. So it is an 8700K, so you actually can overclock it, but I actually can't overclock it in this system just because of my motherboard, and we'll go on to that now, which is the Gigabyte H310M S2H GSM, which is a really budget motherboard, and definitely not a motherboard you want to be pairing with this CPU. The actual CPU that I first initially paired this with is the Pentium G5400, which was a 2-core 4-thread CPU with hyperthreading. So moving from a Pentium G5400 to an 8700K is a huge jump, and I do not recommend pairing this CPU with this motherboard at all costs. The only reason I don't want to upgrade my motherboard to something a lot nicer that will pair better with the CPU is because if I were going to do that, I would rather go all in to going into a newer generation, so going like 12th gen CPU instead of just upgrading my motherboard and staying on this same generation. So I know that's not the best reason, but that's just kind of what I have right now, and I don't really want to waste money on something I don't really need to do right now. So for the CPU cooler, I'm just using the Cooler Master Hyper 212 in all black. I really like it a lot since a lot of my build is all black. I wanted to get the CPU cooler as well because my old one was actually white, so this has been a nice upgrade. So for my RAM, I'm using the Corsair Vengeance 16GB kit. It's clocked at 2400 megahertz, and I know that's not that fast, but since I am on Intel and an older generation, it's not Ryzen, so I don't really need the fastest RAM speed, so it works really well. I definitely do want to upgrade to 32GB soon, since I do a lot of video editing. I really uses up a lot of that 16GB kit, but for gaming and all that other stuff, it still works really well. I'm moving on to another place that I actually upgraded the PC. It's the GTX 1070. So I actually went from a GTX 1063GB to a GTX 1070, which doesn't seem like the biggest jump, but trust me, it really is. I actually spent only $220 on this GPU, and I actually sold my GTX 1060 for $185. So I actually only paid $40 more to get this GPU, which is really sick. And with the cost difference, it is a much better performer compared to the 1063GB. You can definitely see it in all my gaming and video editing. It's just a lot faster, and I'll get to benchmarks later in the video. But yeah, it's been a really great upgrade. So for the power supply, I'm using the Thermaltake 550 watt smart power supply, and I definitely do not recommend getting this PSU. So I actually got this power supply a couple years back, and I didn't check the power supply tier list, which is something I recommend to all new builders or just all builders in general when you're trying to get a power supply. This power supply is actually on tier F, which is replace immediately, so it's definitely not a power supply you want to be getting. The only real reason I still have it in here is because I mean, my parts have been working fine for almost like 4 years now, and I know I have made some significant upgrades. Nothing crazy has happened yet, so I'm just kind of leaving it in there. It's kind of that same case with my motherboard, that if I'm going to upgrade my power supply, I do want to upgrade my GPU as well. But if you are in the same situation as me, I definitely do not recommend this. So if you guys are trying to do something like this build, I recommend getting first a different power supply and a different motherboard, and try to get a newer generation CPU if possible, or you can get something like the i7-8700K, which you can find for around $150, which is pretty crazy for the performance, but just make sure you get a better motherboard that pairs with it. So with all that, that is all the parts that I used to put this together. Most of these parts that I actually bought used off Facebook Marketplace, which is something I recommend to a lot of builders since you can actually find a lot of really good deals. For example, the CPU I bought 3 years ago was actually only $200 at that time, but if you actually search up the CPU right now, you can actually find it for a lot cheaper, from somewhere from $180 to $150 even. Same goes for all the parts here. If you can find really cheap prices on the used market, I recommend checking it out since you can save a ton of money. And especially if you're on a budget under $1,000, this is the best way you can get it under that budget. Okay, so enough with that. Let's get on to all the benchmarks. Okay, so about the benchmarking of the games, I actually realized that I don't own that many games for me to benchmark for you guys. I think I only own like 3 to 4 different games, and most of those games are actually free. So what I'm going to do instead for you guys to show you some benchmarks is actually link you guys to another video which has the same configuration as my PC, so you guys can see, if you guys are actually interested in seeing the benchmarks, what they would be like. I know it's a little bit inconvenient since it's not in this video and you do have to go to another video, but trust me, it's going to be a lot better than if I were to benchmark it for you guys. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'll leave in the link in the description below, and yeah, sorry for that. Okay, and with all that, that is going to be the end of today's video. I hope you guys did enjoy, and make sure you guys do check out my last video on what's in my bag for 2022.